The neighborhood looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. A row of freshly painted houses, trimmed lawns, and an HOA board that kept the streets spotless. Every porch had potted flowers, every mailbox polished to match the others. It was the kind of environment built to feel safe, like a world untouched by the chaos of the city only a few miles away. On the surface, it was perfect. But anyone who has lived long enough knows that perfection doesn't last. It hides things, sometimes deep, sometimes close enough that you can feel them pressing against the skin of ordinary life, waiting for a reason to come out. That summer evening was warm, with a sky painted in orange and purple shades as the sun went down behind the rooftops. Families were inside finishing dinner. A couple of teenagers rode their bikes past the cul-de-sac, their laughter carrying through the air. A sprinkler clicked back and forth on someone's lawn, water droplets catching the last light. It all felt so normal. Too normal. And within that peace, something darker was already circling, already making its way toward one man's front door. He was new to the neighborhood compared to most. Quiet, polite, the kind of neighbor who waved but didn't linger. He had moved in about a year earlier, but people still whispered about him in the way small communities do when someone doesn't fit into their unspoken mold. They didn't know much about his past. They didn't know what his work really was. They only knew he was alone, black, and not the type to join the weekend barbecues or sit at HOA meetings arguing over fence heights. That made him stand out here more than anyone cared to admit. The HOA, though polite on the surface, was known for being something else entirely when it came to control. They were strict, relentless even, about enforcing rules. Trash cans left out too long, a weed popping up in the yard, paint color a shade too bold. For some it was just an annoyance. For others, it was power. And in groups where power is uneven, control turns into obsession. That quiet man who kept to himself? He was already on their radar long before the night strangers showed up at his door. The men who came weren't in official uniforms, though at a glance they could have fooled anyone. They had badges clipped to their belts, radios at their sides, even heavy vests that read police across the front. They moved with the kind of certainty that only comes when someone believes no one will question them. Their truck pulled slowly into the neighborhood, lights off, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. They had rehearsed this. They had practiced what to say, how to move, and how to look like they belonged in authority. The only thing they hadn't counted on was who they were dealing with. Life inside the house before they arrived was calm. He sat in the living room with the blinds half drawn, a glass of water in his hand, the faint sound of the news humming from the TV. It wasn't a flashy home, but it was clean, organized, and every detail in place like it mattered to him. His phone sat on the table within arm's reach. He had habits like that, always careful, always aware without even seeming to be. To anyone else, he looked like an ordinary man winding down after work. But he wasn't ordinary. What no one in the neighborhood knew, what not even the boldest HOA board member dared to imagine, was that the man they had quietly judged from their porches was not someone who could be intimidated. He wasn't a nobody. He wasn't someone who would flinch at fake pole, ice standing at his door. He carried years of experience, scars invisible to anyone who glanced at him, and while he never bragged, never revealed his true life, his silence was not weakness. It was discipline. Still, silence doesn't erase prejudice. It doesn't stop suspicion. In the unspoken rules of that neighborhood, a man like him living alone, minding his own business, was enough to stir unease, enough to make someone wonder, enough to spark whispers that, when left unchecked, grew into something else. And when authority is faked, when it's dressed up in a vest and a badge, the line between ordinary control and criminal intent becomes dangerously thin. The air outside grew heavier as night settled in, the streetlights flickering on one by one. Behind the closed curtains, Families were unaware of what was about to unfold just a few doors down. No one knew that the fragile quiet of their cul-de-sac was about to split open, that beneath the trimmed lawns and polished mailboxes, a dangerous game of power was about to begin. And as those men in fake uniforms stepped out of their truck and adjusted their vests, they carried more than arrogance. They carried the certainty that they had already won. What they didn't know was that the man waiting on the other side of that door was not who they thought he was. The night the men showed up wasn't the first time trouble had brushed against him. It had been building quietly, like water pressing against the walls of a dam. Neighbors noticed him, studied him, and whispered about him long before anyone pretended to be the police. At first, it was small things. The HOA letters slipped into his mailbox, reminders about lawn trimming or driveway stains. Then came the longer stares, the questions that felt harmless on the surface, but cut deeper the more they were asked. What do you do for work? Why are you always gone so late? How come we never see family visiting you? Questions that weren't meant to get to know him, but to box him in. He had learned long ago how to smile politely, how to keep his answers vague. He had seen what happened when you gave too much, when you opened the door to people who didn't deserve it. So he stayed silent. But silence, in places like this, didn't make you invisible. It made you suspicious. The HOA president, a man who wore his authority like armor, started to make his interest clearer. He was the kind of person who never let go of control, someone who believed the rules were his shield. He saw himself as the protector of the neighborhood's image. Behind his clipped words and false smile was resentment. He didn't like the man who lived alone, who didn't play the game, who didn't bend. It wasn't about a lawn or a trash can. It was about power. Soon, that resentment grew legs. Little incidents started piling up. Someone left a note on his car windshield about parking too close to the sidewalk. A neighbor claimed his music was too loud one evening, though he hadn't even turned it on. Another accused him of ignoring neighborhood standards when he had a visitor late at night. They weren't mistakes. They were seeds. Seeds planted to push him, to corner him. And still, he didn't react. He didn't give teat, hem what they wanted. That only made them push harder. Because some people can't stand being ignored, can't stand when their control isn't felt. What they didn't realize was that the man they were testing wasn't built like them. He had carried weight heavier than their stares, secrets darker than their gossip. Outside forces played their part too. The HOA wasn't just a group of people arguing about fences. It was tied to money, property values, and image. They had financial pressure to keep the neighborhood spotless, and for the president, whose own business was failing quietly in the background, the HOA became his stage. Controlling others gave him the power he couldn't find anywhere else. He wasn't just protecting lawns, he was protecting his pride. The other men, the ones who later dressed up as police, weren't strangers to him either. They were tied to the HOA president, men with their own grievances. One had a record he hid carefully, a past mistake that could resurface if the wrong person knew about it. Another had debts he couldn't pay, latching onto any opportunity to prove his worth. Together, they fed each other's bitterness, each bringing their own shadows to the table. And while they plotted, while they whispered about teaching him a lesson, the man at the center of it all lived his life with discipline. Every morning, he ran before the sun came up. Every evening, he kept a routine, calm and steady. But beneath his composure, there was tension too. He had spent years building a life where his past work couldn't follow him, where his enemies couldn't reach him. But he had underestimated something simple, the way prejudice works in plain sight. He could disappear from the eyes of criminals, but not from the eyes of people who saw him as different. There were moments where the tension nearly broke. One evening, a neighbor pounded on his door, shouting about a supposed disturbance. He opened the door calmly, his face unreadable, while the neighbor's rage poured out. He didn't argue. He didn't shout back. He simply let the man rant until his voice cracked and then closed the door. But behind that calm, his hands shook, not from fear but from restraint. He knew what he was capable of. He knew how quickly things could turn if he ever let his discipline slip. But discipline has limits. Even the strongest walls begin to crack when pushed again and again. He started noticing unfamiliar cars driving slowly past his house. He started hearing footsteps outside his window late at night. Sometimes the blinds shifted when no breeze was there. He didn't sleep as easily. His instincts, the ones he had trained for years, told him this wasn't paranoia. It was real. Someone was testing him, watching, waiting. Their obsession grew in the shadows. The HOA president convinced himself that this man was hiding something dangerous, that he was a threat to the neighborhood. It wasn't about lawns or rules anymore. It was about control, about putting someone in their place. And the men around him, carrying their own secrets and debts, went along with it. He found comfort in his authority, even when it led them down a path they couldn't turn back from. What they never understood was that he wasn't the one losing control. They were. Every lie they told, every false claim they spread, tightened the noose around their own necks. And as the plan formed, to confront him, to scare him, to use the weight of fake authority, they mistook silence for weakness. They mistook restraint for fear. The tension reached its sharpest edge on a night when he returned home to find a notice taped to his door. It wasn't the usual typed reminder or official letter. It was handwritten, scrawled in black ink. "We're watching. You don't belong here." He stood there on his porch, holding the paper, his jaw tight, his chest heavy with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Anger. Not the kind that bursts out loud, but the kind that sits deep in the bones. He didn't call anyone. He didn't report it. He just folded the paper neatly, slid it into a drawer, and sat in silence. He had seen worse threats before. He had faced enemies far stronger. But the difference was simple. Those enemies had known who he really was. These men didn't. What they saw was a target. What they didn't see was the storm they were walking into. The stage was set. Every whisper, every lie, every false step had pushed them closer to that night when fake uniforms and false authority would arrive at his door. And though they believed they were in control, the truth was already slipping away from them. The night was quiet enough to hear the hum of streetlights. Crickets sang in the tall grass beyond the fences, their rhythm steady, almost mocking in its calmness. Inside the neighborhood, windows were lit with soft glows. Families watching TV, children finishing homework, couples winding down. No one looked out toward the man's house. No one noticed the dark truck idling at the end of the street with its headlights off. The men inside the truck sat in silence. Their fake vests were strapped tight across their chests, the word police bold and white under the dim dome light. Badges clipped to their belts glinted when they moved. They had rehearsed their lines, their steps, even the way they'd knock on the door. Yet their hands still shook. Sweat collected under their collars, sticking to their skin. One of them muttered that it was too late to back out, that if they didn't go through with it now, the plan would die before it began. The HOA president was in the passenger seat, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the house across the street. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was about pride, about control. He told himself it was about protecting the neighborhood, but deep down, he knew it was personal. The man inside that house had defied him in ways he couldn't tolerate. Quiet defiance is louder than words when it eats at a man's ego. They moved with a shaky confidence as they stepped out of the truck, boots crunching softly against the pavement. The street was empty, the air thick. Their radios clipped at their belts gave the illusion of authority, their flashlights slicing through the shadows as they approached the front door. Inside, the man had been sitting on his couch, but he felt it before he heard it. a shift in the air. His instincts, sharpened by years of training, picked up the unnatural quiet outside. He stood slowly, leaving his glass of water half full on the table, and moved toward the window. Through a narrow slit in the blinds, he caught sight of the figures approaching. The vests, the badges. To most people, it would look real. But to him, it didn't add up. Their walk was wrong. Their stance was wrong. Their energy was off. The knock on the door came sharply, echoing through the hallway. "Police! Open up!" one of them barked. He stayed still, his pulse steady. Eddie, his breath controlled. He didn't move to the door right away. He let the silence stretch. He wanted to hear how they'd react. On the porch, the men exchanged uneasy glances. They knocked again, harder this time, their voices louder, less patient. "Open the door now!" Inside, he weighed his options. He knew this wasn't what it looked like. He knew real law enforcement wouldn't show up like this, not without warning, not in this way. His training screamed at him. This was a setup. And so he did what he had done countless times before in darker places than this neighborhood. He prepared. He checked the lock. Secure. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the drawer where his weapon was stored. He didn't want to use it, but he wasn't about to be dragged out by men playing dress-up with authority. The porch creaked as they shifted, whispering to one another. One of them pulled at his vest like it was too tight. Another adjusted his badge. Their confidence was cracking. The HOA president clenched his fists. He had promised them this would be easy, that the man inside would fold under pressure, but nothing about this felt easy. Finally, the door rattled under their fists, louder, harder. The sound echoed through the street, but no neighbor peeked out a window. Fear keeps people still. And even without knowing what was happening, the families around them felt something wrong in the air. The man inside moved closer to the door, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped just behind it, his hand resting on the frame. "What's the warrant for?" he asked, his voice low, calm, steady. The men froze. They hadn't expected that. They hadn't planned for questions. They had planned for obedience. The HOA president recovered first, barking, "Open the door before we force it open." But the tone gave him away. The man inside knew. Real law enforcement didn't stumble like that, didn't bluff so clumsily. His jaw tightened. His instincts confirmed it. This wasn't the law. This was something else. The next few seconds cracked open like lightning. The men on the porch decided to act. One of them rammed his shoulder against the door. It shuddered in its frame, the echo reverberating through the quiet house. Another shouted again, their voices breaking, desperate to sound like authority, but falling into chaos instead. The man inside didn't flinch. He reached for the drawer in the hallway, his fingers brushing the cold steel he hadn't touched in months. He didn't want to use it, but the line had already been crossed. His body moved with muscle memory, his mind calculating angles, exits, reactions. He wasn't thinking like a neighbor anymore. He was thinking like what he truly was, a man trained to survive. The third blow against the door cracked the frame. Wood splintered, the sound sharp and final. The men surged forward, adrenaline pushing them through. The door gave way, swinging open into darkness. Flashlights swept across the room, cutting through shadows. And then it happened. The man stood in the hallway, calm but coiled, weapon in hand. His voice cut through the chaos. "Federal agent, drop your weapons." Shock tore through them. For a moment they froze, their breath caught in their throats. FBI. The words sank like stones. They had expected a man alone, vulnerable, uneasy to break. Instead, They found themselves staring into the eyes of someone who had seen worse men than them fall apart in interrogation rooms. Someone who wasn't afraid. But fear makes people reckless. One of them raised his flashlight, the beam blinding, and shouted back, "You're lying!" Another lunged forward, reaching for him, and in that split second, the house erupted. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet night, deafening, sharp, echoing down the cul-de-sac. Glass shattered as a bullet tore through a picture frame. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, burning sharp in their throats. Shouts turned to screams. Panic cracked their thin layer of bravado. The HOA president stumbled back, his heart pounding in his ears. This wasn't in control anymore. This wasn't intimidation. This was survival, and they were losing. He tried to shout orders, but his voice was drowned in the chaos. The men scattered inside the entryway, their fake badges glinting in the flicker of flashlights as they scrambled. One dropped his weapon, his hands trembling as reality crashed into him. Another cursed, his words breaking, regret spilling out too late. The man in the hallway moved with precision, his training unfolding in every step, every breath. He didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. Years of discipline guided him through the storm. But inside, beneath the steady exterior, his chest burned with rage. Not at the men themselves, but at the fact that it had come to this, that his quiet life had been torn open by arrogance and hate. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving behind ringing ears and shattered silence. The entryway was chaos. Splintered wood, scattered badges, blood smeared across the floor where one of the men had fallen. The smell of iron hung thick in the air. For a long moment, no one moved. The men who were still standing stared at him, their eyes wide, their breath ragged. They looked at him not as a neighbor anymore, but as what he truly was, a force they had never been prepared to face. And in that moment, panic took hold. They bolted, stumbling, shoving, scrambling out the broken door into the night. Their truck roared to life, tires screeching against the pavement as they fled. Inside, he stood alone in the wreckage, his chest heaving, his hand still tight around the weapon. His living room was torn apart, his safe place shattered. He looked down at the floor, at the man who hadn't made it out, and for the first time that night, a flicker of something human crossed his face. Not regret exactly, but a weight. The familiar heaviness of knowing that violence, once unleashed, can never be taken back. The night did not stay quiet for long. Gunfire in a neighborhood like that couldn't go unnoticed. Within minutes, blinds cracked open, trembling hands dialed 911, and whispers turned into frantic retellings. I heard shots. It came from his house. I think someone's hurt. The cul-de-sac, once a picture of control and calm, was now a place people were afraid to step into. Lights flickered on across the street, but doors stayed locked. No one wanted to be the first to face what had just happened. Inside the house, he stood still, his weapon lowered but not yet put away. His breathing was steady, but beneath it, he felt the familiar heaviness press against his ribs. He had seen this before, in alleys, in basements, in places no one ever put in reports. Violence left an echo, a weight you could not shake off by walking away. The man on the floor wasn't moving, and the blood was spreading across the hardwood in a way that would stain forever. He didn't feel regret in the way people expected. He felt the cost. Every time something like this happened, there was a cost. The others fled, but running doesn't erase what's been done. In their truck, the fake badges tossed onto the floorboard, the men argued in panicked voices. One shouted that they had gone too far, that it was supposed to be a scare, not this. Another swore under his breath, saying they had no choice, that the man inside had forced it to happen. Their denials spun in circles, each one trying to dump the weight off their shoulders, each one refusing to admit the truth. They had walked in with arrogance, and now carried blood on their hands. The HOA president sat silent in the passenger seat, his hands clenched so tight that the skin on his knuckles split. He had led them into it, and now the image he fought so hard to protect was in pieces. By the time real law enforcement arrived, the street was cordoned off with flashing lights and yellow tape. Officers moved cautiously into the house, weapons drawn, until the man raised his hands and identified himself. "Special Agent, FBI." His voice didn't waver, but his eyes showed exhaustion, the kind that comes when the line between work and survival blurs. He handed over his weapon, his badge, his story, all with the same discipline he had carried through the night. Still, the room fell into a stunned silence. A man the neighborhood had whispered about for so long was not just a neighbor. He was one of the most feared agents in the bureau, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the fences and manicured lawns. The shock rippled outward. The neighbors who had doubted him, who had gossiped in hushed voices about his quiet life, now faced a different truth. The man they thought didn't belong had carried more authority, more weight, than all their petty rules combined. Some felt shame. Others doubled down, muttering that he must have provoked it somehow. Prejudice doesn't vanish even when proven wrong. It just shifts its excuses. Fu. The men who fled. The aftermath was heavier than they could bear. One of them drank until his hands stopped shaking, trying to blur the memory of the gunshots from his head. Another sat in silence for hours, staring at his stained vest, the letters police, now nothing but a mockery. The HOA president locked himself in his office, replaying the night in his mind until the walls closed in. He tried to tell himself it was justified, that the man had brought it on himself. But deep down, the truth pressed harder. Pride had driven him into this, and pride couldn't save him now. The media swarmed quickly, as they always do when violence cracks open in a place that's supposed to be safe. Headlines painted the story in bold strokes. Fake police raid ends in bloodshed. FBI agent defends home from imposters. Reporters stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac, their cameras pointed at the once quiet house, their voices heavy with speculation. They wanted answers, but answers didn't come easily. Neighbors contradicted each other. Some said he was polite and kept to himself. Others swore he was strange and gave off bad energy. The truth was tangled in their own biases, their own discomfort with who he was, and how little they had truly known him. For the community, the illusion of safety was shattered. It wasn't just about one man or one night. It was about the fact that violence could wear the mask of authority and walk right up to someone's door. Parents held their children closer, looking twice at anyone in uniform. Trust, once cracked, didn't heal quickly. For him, the days that followed were heavier than the night itself. He sat through debriefings, retold the story in careful detail, and relived every second in rooms filled with sharp eyes and sharper questions. He wasn't under suspicion. His record spoke for itself. But even in the halls of the bureau, he felt the weight of being the man at the center of it. He had survived, yes, but survival always came with ghosts. At night, when the house was quiet again, he walked past the spot where the blood had stained the floor. He had cleaned it, but the memory stayed. Every creak of the floorboards reminded him of the moment the door splintered, of the choice he had to make. He told himself it was justified, that he had acted as he was trained to act. But justification doesn't always ease the silence afterward. The HOA crumbled in the weeks that followed. Meetings dissolved into shouting matches, accusations flung across tables. The president, once so commanding, avoided the very neighbors he had once ruled over. Whispers turned against him. He pushed it too far. He dragged others into this. His power slipped away, not in one dramatic fall, but in slow, painful pieces. The same pride that drove him was now the rope around his neck. For the men who had run, the law eventually caught up. They couldn't outrun evidence, badges, vests, bullet casings, fingerprints. Their names hit the news, their faces spread across screens. Families who once trusted them now sat in shock, their children staring at fathers they couldn't recognize anymore. Guilt gnawed at them, but each carried it differently, some denying, some drowning, some breaking entirely under the weight. The community never looked the same again. The painted fences, the manicured lawns, the perfect mailboxes, all of it felt like a mask that had slipped. People locked their doors tighter, avoided eye contact, and carried a quiet fear in their steps. Safety, they realized, was never about fences or rules. It was about trust, and trust had been shattered. And for the man at the center of it all, the quiet neighbor who was never truly what they thought, life returned to its routine on the surface. He still ran before dawn. He still kept his house clean, his habits precise. But beneath it, the quiet had changed. He knew the neighborhood would never see him the same way. Some would fear him now, others would respect him, and a few would hate him more. But he didn't live for their approval. He never had. Still, when he closed his eyes at night, the echoes remained. The knock on the door, the splinter of wood, the flash of light, the sound of gunfire that would forever mark the night when false authority met real power and pride met its end. Justice, when it came, didn't arrive in the clean, simple way that people imagine. There was no single moment where the community exhaled, no clear line between right and wrong neatly tied with a bow. Instead, it unfolded in pieces, court dates, depositions, headlines that flared hot for a week before fading into the next story. But for those whose lives had been split by that night, the consequences stayed. The men who had fled from the house didn't escape for long. Their plan had been clumsy, their disguises riddled with evidence. The fake vests, the radios, the truck, all of it became exhibits in court. One by one, their names appeared on arrest warrants, their mugshots plastered across television screens. Families who had once believed they were decent men sat in courtrooms, their faces pale, their hands trembling, as prosecutors laid out the lies in brutal detail. Some of the impostors broke quickly, their voices shaking as they pled guilty to avoid the heaviest sentences. Others fought harder, spinning stories of misunderstanding, of being led astray, of just following orders. But the law had little patience for men who dressed up in authority they didn't have and tried to wield it with violence. Sentences came down heavy, years stretching out ahead of them like iron bars. The HOA president's downfall was the hardest to watch. A man who had once strutted through the neighborhood with a clipboard and a false sense of power now sat slouched in a courtroom chair, his tie loose, his face drawn. Pride had been his armor, but armor cracks when exposed to truth. His insistence that he only wanted to protect the neighborhood crumbled, ed under the weight of evidence. His neighbors, the same people he had bullied and intimidated for years, now stared at him with a mix of disgust and pity. His reputation, once a mask of control, was gone for good. And while prison walls closed in around him, the far greater punishment was knowing that the world would only ever remember him as a fraud, a coward who mistook arrogance for leadership. For the FBI agent, the aftermath took a different shape. He wasn't charged, he had acted within his rights, defended his home, and protected himself. On paper, his actions were justified. But justification doesn't erase scars. He returned to work, though whispers followed him now more than ever. Colleagues who admired his composure also saw the exhaustion in his eyes. Friends checked in, but he rarely spoke about the night. And at home, when the blinds rattled in the wind, or when footsteps echoed too close to his door, his hand still twitched toward the drawer in the hallway. The discipline that had carried him through the night now kept him upright in the days after, but the weight never left. Survival has a way of keeping company long after the danger passes. The neighborhood tried to move on, but cracks remained. People who once obsessed over lawns and fences now spoke in hushed tones about safety, about trust, about how quickly order could collapse. The HOA, once the unchallenged voice of authority, never regained its footing. Meetings became sparse, rules loosened, and in time, the very structure collapsed. The illusion of control had been broken beyond repair. Some families sold their homes, moving elsewhere to escape the memory. Others stayed but carried a different caution in their eyes, a knowledge that safety is fragile, that authority can be faked, and that prejudice can grow into violence if left unchecked. The media moved on, as it always does, but the story left ripples. Questions rose in editorials and broadcasts. How easy is it to impersonate authority? How quickly do we obey when someone shows up with a badge and a vest? What does it say about us that we trust the symbol of power more than the truth of a person's character? For weeks, it sparked debates about policing, about the weight of prejudice, about the lines between control and abuse. Then, as new stories took the spotlight, the noise faded. But for those who had lived it, the noise never left. What lingered most was not just the crime itself, but what it revealed. It showed how power, when built on pride instead of principle, corrodes. It showed how prejudice, when left unchecked, grows teeth. And it showed how silence, the quiet resilience of one man, can be misread as weakness until it proves to be strength. The impostors had believed that intimidation was enough, that control could be faked. They learned too late that real power doesn't come from costumes or badges. It comes from discipline, from truth, from the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. The tragedy lay in the waste of it all. Men who could have lived ordinary lives instead destroyed themselves, chasing a false sense of authority. A neighborhood that could have been safe and united instead fractured under the weight of its own prejudice. And a man who had only wanted peace, who had built his life around control and order, was forced once again into violence he never asked for. Was justice served? In a legal sense, yes. The guilty were punished, sentences handed down, names tarnished. But justice is not always about the courtroom. For the families who lost husbands, fathers, and brothers to prison, the pain was permanent. For the neighbors who had believed the lies, trust was gone. And for the man who had defended his home, the victory was hollow. He was alive, but peace, once broken, is never easily rebuilt. The broader questions lingered in the silence left behind. How do we define authority in a world where it can be faked so easily? How do we protect against prejudice that wears the mask of community standards? And what happens when the hunger for control becomes stronger than the respect for human dignity? In the end, the story wasn't just about one neighborhood or one night of violence. It was about human nature, about pride, about fear, about the thin line between order and chaos. It was about the ways people justify cruelty to protect their own illusions of power. And it was about resilience, about the quiet strength of someone who refuses to be broken, even when the world tries to corner him. The cul-de-sac eventually fell silent again. Lawns trimmed, porches swept, mailboxes polished. But beneath that surface, the memory lived on. For those who had been there, every creak of a porch step, every knock at the door, carried a different weight. And for the man at the center of it all, the one they had misjudged from the start, life went on. Not the same, not untouched, but steady. Because that was who he was. Steady when others broke. Calm when others panicked. A man who had faced the mask of false authority and exposed it for what it was. And that is what remains when the noise dies down. The truth that power without integrity collapses, that prejudice poisons communities, and that sometimes survival itself is the loudest form of justice.